The night my family cut me off, they thought it was the end of my story. A long dinner table. Quiet judgment. My mother calmly announcing I was no longer worth supporting. They expected me to panic, to explain myself, to finally admit failure. Instead, I stayed silent. I reached into my bag and opened my laptop. What appeared on that screen didn't just shock them, it rewrote everything they thought they knew about me. Conversations stopped. Faces changed. And in that moment, the people who had always controlled the narrative realized they had underestimated me for years. The dinner started the way it always did: too much food, forced smiles, and conversations that never went deeper than surface-level updates. The table was long, polished, and crowded with relatives who knew each other well enough to judge, but not well enough to listen. I took my seat quietly, nodding in greeting, already sensing the familiar tension settle in my chest. At first, it was subtle. A comment about how expensive everything had become. A joke about people who still hadn't figured out their careers. Eyes flicked toward me and then away again. No one said my name, but I didn't need them to. I knew exactly who the remarks were meant for. My mother smiled too much, the way she always did when she wanted control without confrontation. My father stayed silent, cutting his food carefully, avoiding eye contact. Across the table, an aunt asked my cousin about his promotion, her voice full of pride. When she turned to me, she paused, then asked, "So, what are you up to these days?" The question sounded polite, but it wasn't curious. "I'm busy," I said simply. That seemed to disappoint her. Busy wasn't a story they could dissect. As plates were passed around, the atmosphere grew colder. Conversations resumed without me, as if my presence was something to work around. I felt myself shrinking, not because I lacked confidence, but because I'd learned long ago that taking up space here only invited scrutiny. This wasn't new. Family dinners had always followed this rhythm: subtle judgments disguised as concern, support offered only if it came with control. Tonight felt different, though. Sharper. Like something was building beneath the table, unspoken but inevitable. I glanced at my bag resting against the chair leg. Inside it sat my laptop, heavy with more than just metal and glass. I didn't touch it. Not yet. I stayed quiet, listening, waiting, because I knew this dinner wasn't going to end the way they expected. I and my family, support was never free. It came wrapped in expectations, reminders, and quiet threats that were never spoken out loud but always understood. Help was offered only if it kept everyone comfortable, only if it kept me small. Growing up, my parents loved to remind me how much they'd done. Paid bills. Connections. Advice I didn't ask for but was expected to follow. Any independence was treated like rebellion, and any success that didn't pass through them first was met with skepticism instead of pride. If I made my own decision, they questioned it. If I struggled, they used it as proof that I needed them. Either way, the message was clear: support was leverage. And leverage meant control. At the dinner table, that control showed itself in subtle ways. My mother spoke for me when relatives asked questions. My father framed my life choices like temporary detours instead of deliberate paths. They presented themselves as patient, generous, long-suffering, quiet heroes burdened with a child who just wouldn't listen. What hurt wasn't the money. It was the implication that without them, I was nothing. That my worth depended on how useful I was to the family narrative they'd built. I learned early that pushing back only made things worse. Arguments turned into lectures. Boundaries were labeled as disrespect. So I adapted. I accepted help carefully. I shared less. I stopped correcting them when they misrepresented my life. They mistook my silence for dependence. At that table, watching them exchange knowing looks, I realized they still believed the same thing: that I needed them more than they needed me. That the balance of power hadn't shifted. They were wrong. What they called support had never been about helping me stand. It had been about making sure I didn't walk too far away. And tonight, they were about to learn what happens when control disappears, and all that's left is the truth that my family had always confused quiet with weakness. Because I didn't argue, they assumed I agreed. Because I didn't brag, they assumed I had nothing to brag about. Over time, that assumption hardened into belief, and belief became the version of me they shared with others. They liked simple labels. My cousin was the achiever. My sister was the responsible one. I was still figuring things out. That phrase followed me everywhere, said with sympathetic smiles and gentle head shakes, as if my life were permanently unfinished. What they never saw was how deliberate my silence was. I didn't move loudly. I didn't announce milestones. I built things privately, piece by piece, without inviting commentary or approval. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I didn't want their expectations shaping my choices. Every time I succeeded quietly, it made them uncomfortable. Success they couldn't guide or claim felt threatening. So they ignored it. Or minimized it. Or pretended it was temporary. I let them. Correcting them felt exhausting. Explaining myself felt pointless. It was easier to let them underestimate me than to fight for recognition in a room that only listened when it benefited them. They assumed I needed direction because I didn't ask for applause. They assumed I was dependent because I didn't ask for permission. They mistook independence for uncertainty, and certainty for arrogance. At the dinner table, I watched it play out again. The casual remarks. The sympathetic tone. The way conversations flowed around me instead of toward me. They weren't trying to hurt me. They genuinely believed their version of the truth. That was the dangerous part. When people underestimate you long enough, they stop imagining what you're capable of. They stop asking questions. They stop seeing you clearly at all. And that night, surrounded by people who thought they knew me, I realized something important. Being underestimated had protected me. Because no one ever looks for power where they assume there is none, the moment came quietly, disguised as concern. My mother set her fork down and sighed, the way she did when she wanted the room's attention without raising her voice. "We just worry about you," she said, glancing around the table so everyone could hear. "You can't keep drifting forever." The word drifting landed harder than she intended. It wasn't just inaccurate, it was dismissive. It reduced years of work, discipline, and restraint into something aimless. My father nodded along, adding, "At some point, you have to be realistic." His tone was calm, reasonable, almost kind. That made it worse. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably. No one interrupted. Silence, in my family, always meant agreement. I felt heat rise in my chest, not anger, but clarity. This wasn't about advice. It was about control. About reminding me of my place at the table. I could have corrected them. I could have listed facts, defended choices, demanded respect. Instead, I took a slow sip of water and let the moment stretch. That pause unsettled them more than any argument would have. My mother's smile tightened. She wasn't used to me not filling the space she created. "Don't take it personally," she added quickly. "We just want what's best for you." What she wanted was obedience. Approval. Gratitude for guidance I never asked for. Something inside me settled then. The line had been crossed, not because of what was said, but because of how easily they said it, assuming I'd absorb it like always. I looked around the table, at faces waiting for my reaction. They didn't know it yet, but that comment had ended something. Not the dinner. The illusion that they still had authority over my life. Why mother didn't raise her voice when she said it. She didn't need to. She leaned back in her chair, folded her napkin carefully, and spoke with the calm certainty of someone who believed the decision had already been made. "We're done supporting you," she said. "It's time you learn to stand on your own." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Around the table, no one reacted right away. A few relatives avoided eye contact. Others watched me closely, waiting to see if I'd break, argue, or beg. I felt an unexpected calm wash over me. Not relief, recognition. This was the moment they'd been circling all night. The comment about drifting. The talk of realism. This was the conclusion they'd prepared. My father cleared his throat but said nothing. His silence felt like agreement. Or surrender. I wasn't sure which. My mother continued, explaining it like a lesson. No more help. No safety net. No, bailing me out. She framed it as tough love, as if cutting me off was an act of generosity rather than control. What struck me most wasn't the decision itself. It was how confident she was that this would hurt me. That it would scare me into compliance. That without their support, I'd collapse. I nodded slowly, acknowledging her words without emotion. That seemed to confuse her. She paused, searching my face for resistance, for fear, for gratitude, anything familiar. I offered none. The table remained quiet. No one came to my defense. No one questioned her authority to make this announcement on behalf of everyone else. In that silence, I realized something important. They thought this was the end of my options. They had no idea it was the beginning of theirs running out. Everyone at the table seemed to expect something from me. A protest. An explanation. Maybe even tears. When none came, the silence stretched longer than anyone was comfortable with. I could feel the weight of their attention pressing in, waiting for me to fill the space they'd created. But I didn't react because I'd learned long ago that timing matters more than volume. Emotional responses gave them control. Calm took it away. Inside, I wasn't numb. I was alert. Listening. Observing how my mother's confidence softened when I didn't push back. How my father finally looked up, unsettled by the absence of drama. They were used to predictable reactions. They weren't prepared for stillness. I'd had years to practice restraint. To sit through comments designed to provoke. To swallow assumptions that weren't true. Reacting now would have meant playing the role they expected, the dependent one, the defensive one. So I stayed quiet. I let them assume the cut had landed. I let them believe their words had power. That belief would make what came next sharper. My hands rested calmly on the table, though my heart beat steadily beneath my ribs. I wasn't afraid. I was resolved. There's a difference between freezing and choosing not to move. Around us, conversation tried to restart. Someone mentioned dessert. Another poured more wine. But the tension didn't lift. It sat there, unaddressed, growing heavier by the second. I knew I had a choice in that moment. I could leave, preserving the illusion they'd built. Or I could stay, and let the truth dismantle it. I stayed. Because reacting too soon would have been emotional. Waiting would be strategic. And strategy was something they'd never expected from me. The weight of my bag against the chair legs suddenly felt heavier, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. No one else noticed it. To them, it was just another accessory, something unimportant, forgettable. That felt fitting. Inside was my laptop. Scuffed at the corners. Unremarkable on the outside. It didn't look like power. It didn't look like proof. And that was exactly why I'd never brought it out before. That laptop held years of quiet work. Long nights. Missed calls. Decisions made without advice or approval. Numbers that told a story no one at this table had ever bothered to ask about. Contracts signed digitally. Companies built remotely. Growth tracked patiently, deliberately. I hadn't brought it to show off. I'd brought it because something in me had known, long before the dinner started, that tonight might require evidence. Not to convince them of my worth, but to end the narrative they'd written for me. My mother was speaking again, explaining her decision as if she were doing me a favor. I listened, nodding at the right moments, all while my mind ran through what would happen next. Not with excitement. With certainty. Reveals lose their power when rushed. They need the right silence. The right disbelief. The right moment when everyone thinks the story is already finished. I waited for that moment. Across the table, someone laughed too loudly. Another relative checked their phone. They thought the tension was passing. That the dinner would move on and this uncomfortable exchange would be forgotten. They were wrong. I slid my chair back slightly, just enough to free the bag. The zipper made a soft sound as I opened it, barely noticeable, but enough to turn a few heads. Still, no one imagined what was coming. To them, I was just reaching for something small. They didn't realize I was about to change the entire conversation. And once that screen came on, there would be no rewinding what they were about to see. The room seemed to quiet on its own as I lifted the laptop from my bag and placed it on the table. The action was simple, almost casual, yet it drew attention in a way words never had. Conversations stalled. Forks rested against plates. Eyes followed my hands. I didn't rush. I opened the screen slowly, letting the soft click of the hinge cut through the tension. The familiar glow reflected briefly on my face, and for a moment, no one spoke. They were curious now, not concerned, not judgmental. Curious. My mother frowned, clearly irritated. "What is this?" she asked, her tone sharp with impatience. "I just want to show you something," I said. My voice sounded steady, even to me. The screen loaded, and I turned the laptop so everyone could see. Rows of numbers appeared, clean, organized, undeniable. At first, no one understood what they were looking at. Then my uncle leaned forward. Someone else squinted, adjusting their glasses. "What am I looking at?" a cousin asked. I waited a beat longer than necessary before answering. "My companies," I said. "All of them." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't polite. It wasn't dismissive. It was stunned. My mother leaned closer now, confusion replacing confidence. "That can't be right," she said quietly. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I simply scrolled. Graphs moved smoothly across the screen. Growth curves. Revenue streams. Names they didn't recognize, tied together by one unmistakable total. A few people exchanged looks. The air shifted. The story they thought they knew was unraveling in real time, and there was no pause button. I watched their faces instead of the screen. Shock spread slowly, then all at once. Mouths parted. Brows furrowed. Pride turned to disbelief. For the first time all evening, no one spoke over me. Because numbers don't raise their voice. They just sit there, patient, unarguable, waiting to be seen. The first words came out as a whisper, barely audible over the hum of the room. "Is that real?" My aunt asked it, but she wasn't really asking me. She was asking the table. Asking permission to believe what she was seeing. I didn't answer right away. I let the screen speak. The numbers didn't flicker or disappear. They didn't apologize for existing. They stayed exactly where they were. My cousin leaned closer, his earlier confidence gone. "That's not just income," he said slowly. "That's ownership." I nodded once. Chairs shifted. Someone exhaled sharply. My father finally leaned forward, his fork forgotten. He stared at the total at the bottom of the screen, blinking like it might change if he looked long enough. My mother shook her head, almost laughing. "No," she said. "You would have told us." That was the moment it clicked for me. They didn't doubt the numbers because they were impossible. They doubted them because they didn't fit the version of me they'd chosen to believe. "I didn't need to," I replied. The table went quiet again, but this silence was heavier. Charged. People started doing mental math, connecting dots, replaying old conversations in their heads, moments where they'd assumed, dismissed, overlooked. "Since when?" someone asked. "Years," I said. One word. Enough. My father's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, he didn't know what to say. My mother sat back slowly, her posture collapsing in on itself. The authority she'd carried all evening slipped away, replaced by something close to fear. Not of me, but of what this meant. Because if this was real, then everything they'd said tonight was wrong. Everything they'd believed about my dependence, my direction, my need for them, wrong. No one interrupted. No one joked. No one changed the subject. They were too busy realizing that the person they had just cut off had already built an empire without them. That I didn't launch into a speech. I didn't list achievements like trophies. I simply explained what they were seeing, piece by piece, the same way I'd built it, quietly and without drama. I pointed to the first column. "That's the holding company," I said. "It owns the rest." A few heads nodded, more out of habit than understanding. I scrolled again. "These are regional firms," I continued. "Different industries. Different teams. I don't run them day to day." I paused. "I hire people who are better than me." That seemed to confuse them. They were used to stories where success was loud and visible. This was neither. I explained how it started small. How one project funded the next. How I reinvested instead of spending. How I kept my life simple so the work could compound. No shortcuts. No sudden miracles. Just consistency. Someone asked why they'd never heard about it. "Because you never asked," I said gently. That landed harder than any accusation. My mother watched me like she was seeing a stranger. My father stared at the screen, still trying to reconcile the numbers with his memory of me. I showed them timelines. Growth over years. Slow at first. Then steady. Then undeniable. Not luck. Not inheritance. Just patience and planning. I wasn't trying to impress them. I was closing a chapter. When I finished, I shut the laptop halfway, leaving just enough light to remind them it was still there. Proof doesn't need to stay on display. No one applauded. No one congratulated me. They didn't know how. Because when the story you believed collapses, the hardest part isn't admitting you were wrong. It's realizing how long you chose not to look. The shift wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no sudden alliances forming. It happened quietly, the way truth usually does, slowly, then all at once. Conversations that had once flowed past me now angled toward my parents instead. My uncle cleared his throat and asked my father how long he'd known. The question wasn't accusatory, but it wasn't gentle either. My father hesitated, eyes darting briefly to my mother before answering, and that pause said more than words ever could. A cousin leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying my mother with a new kind of curiosity. "So when you said you were cutting support," he began, then trailed off, letting the implication hang. My mother tried to recover. She straightened her posture, smiled tightly, and explained how parents sometimes have to make hard choices. But the confidence was gone. Her voice wavered at the edges, and no one nodded along like they had earlier. People started asking questions, not about me, but about them. Why they spoke the way they did. Why they seemed so certain I needed help. Why, this was the first time anyone was hearing about my work. The balance at the table shifted. Subtly. Irreversibly. My parents had always controlled the narrative here. Tonight, they were defending it. I sat back and listened. I didn't add fuel. I didn't correct anyone. I let the room do what it needed to do on its own. That seemed to unsettle them more than confrontation would have. They were used to me reacting, absorbing tension, smoothing things over. Without that familiar role, they looked exposed. My father finally spoke, attempting to change the subject. It didn't work. The questions kept circling. For the first time in my life, the table wasn't judging me. It was reassessing them. And once that happens, there's no way to put things back the way they were. My mother reached for her wine glass, then stopped halfway, as if she'd forgotten why it was there. She set it down carefully and turned toward me, her voice softer than it had been all evening. "We didn't realize," she said. "If we'd known, things might have been different." Different. The words sat between us, heavy with meaning. She wasn't apologizing for the judgment. Or the dismissal. Or the announcement that had been meant to humble me. She was apologizing for being wrong about my position. For miscalculating my value. My father nodded along, clearing his throat. "We were just trying to motivate you," he added. "You know how parents worry." I did know. I also knew when worry was being used as a cover. I looked at both of them and felt something unexpected, not anger, not satisfaction. Just distance. The kind that forms when you finally understand someone clearly. "If this had come out next year," I asked quietly, "would you be saying this now?" No one answered. My mother reached for my hand, then thought better of it. Her smile flickered, unsure which version of herself to present. The authority figure. The concerned parent. The ally. All of them were late. "I don't need an apology," I said, and I meant it. I needed honesty. A long time ago. That seemed to land harder than rejection would have. Around the table, people avoided eye contact, suddenly aware they were witnessing something private. The energy shifted again, not toward reconciliation, but recognition. My parents had believed support gave them power. That night proved something else entirely. Power disappears the moment it's used to control instead of care. And apologies offered only after leverage is gone don't rebuild trust. They just confirm what you already know. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't relive old wounds. I simply stood where I was, steady, finished with explanations. While they realized that some things can't be smoothed over once the truth has been seen, there was a moment when everyone seemed to expect something more from me. A speech. A victory lap. Maybe even a sharp comment to balance the years of quiet judgment. I could feel it hanging in the air, the assumption that now it was my turn to humiliate someone else. I didn't. I closed the laptop fully and rested my hands on the table, grounding myself in the simplicity of the gesture. "I didn't show you this to prove anything," I said calmly. "And I didn't bring it up to embarrass anyone." A few people looked surprised by that. My mother looked confused. "I showed it because I was done being spoken about like I wasn't capable," I continued. "That's all. No blame. No raised voice. Just the truth, stripped of emotion." I explained that success hadn't changed me, it had clarified me. That I'd learned early how easily opinions harden into labels, and how difficult they are to undo once people get comfortable with them. I told them I'd stop trying to correct those labels because my life didn't require their approval to function. The room stayed quiet. Not awkward. Attentive. "I don't need anyone's permission to live the way I do," I said. "But I also won't sit quietly while my life is reduced to a misunderstanding." That was the boundary. Clear. Unmovable. My parents didn't interrupt. They couldn't. There was nothing defensive in my tone for them to push against. I wasn't asking them to change. I wasn't demanding respect. I was simply naming what I would and wouldn't accept going forward. That seemed to unsettle them more than anger ever could. Because gloating invites arguments. Calm truth ends them. And as I sat back in my chair, I realized something important. I hadn't won anything that night. I just stopped losing myself to their expectations. And that felt like enough. No one told me to stay, and no one asked me to leave. The conversation slowly restarted around me, but it felt hollow now, like a performance everyone had forgotten the purpose of. Plates were pushed aside. Glasses were refilled. Laughter tried to return, but it never quite landed. I stood up calmly and reached for my coat. The movement drew attention again, not sharply this time, but with a quiet awareness that something important was ending. My mother looked up first, her mouth parting slightly as if she wanted to say something. She didn't. "I'm heading out," I said simply. A few relatives murmured goodbyes. Someone wished me a safe drive. Their voices sounded different now, more careful, more respectful, but also uncertain, as if they weren't sure which version of me they were supposed to address. I didn't linger. I didn't wait for permission or reassurance. I picked up my bag, feeling its weight settle comfortably against my shoulder, and walked toward the door. Behind me, the table remained seated. No one followed. No one stopped me. And strangely, that felt right. As I stepped outside, the air felt cooler, cleaner. The quiet of the street wrapped around me, steady and grounding. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing, letting the night absorb the tension I'd carried inside for years. I realized then that walking away wasn't dramatic. It wasn't symbolic. It was practical. I'd said what needed to be said. I'd shown what needed to be shown. There was nothing left to prove and no applause worth waiting for. Inside that house, they were still processing what had happened, replaying words, questioning assumptions, adjusting their understanding of who I was. That work belonged to them now. I unlocked my car and got in, the door closing with a soft, final click. As I drove away, I didn't feel victorious. I felt light. Free in a way that didn't need witnesses. Sometimes the strongest statement you can make isn't staying to be seen. It's knowing when to leave, and doing it without looking back. Driving home that night, I realized something unexpected. Being cut off hadn't taken anything from me. It had given me clarity. For years, I'd carried the quiet weight of other people's expectations, trying to manage their comfort, their assumptions, their version of who I was supposed to be. That night, all of it fell away. I understood now that dependence isn't always financial. Sometimes it's emotional. Sometimes it's the habit of explaining yourself to people who've already decided what they believe. Losing that invisible tether felt lighter than I ever imagined. My parents hadn't meant to free me. They thought cutting support would bring me back into line, remind me where I stood. Instead, it confirmed something I'd long suspected: I'd been standing on my own for a very long time already. What surprised me most wasn't their reaction, it was mine. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel the urge to prove anything further. I felt settled. Grounded in the knowledge that my life didn't require constant translation to be valid. That dinner marked the end of an old pattern. No more shrinking to keep the peace. No more silence mistaken for weakness. No more accepting roles that no longer fit. I knew the days ahead wouldn't be magically easy. Boundaries never are. Some relationships would shift. Some conversations would stay uncomfortable. But discomfort felt like a fair price for honesty. My empire, if that's what they wanted to call it, was never the point. It wasn't about money or numbers on a screen. It was about building something quietly, deliberately, without permission. Proof that a life can grow strong even when no one is watching. Cutting me off didn't humble me. It revealed me, to them, and to myself. And as I pulled into my driveway, turning off the engine and sitting in the quiet, one thought settled clearly in my mind. When people lose control over you, they often mistake it for losing you. But what you're really doing is finally choosing yourself.